All right. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Montgomery for All's August meeting. Tonight's topic is how to talk about smart growth. I'm really excited about this because this isn't really something that I have done before, and I don't believe that Montgomery for All or CSG has done before. So I think that this will be a really interesting conversation and discussion, and I'm excited to get to it. So before we jumped into it tonight, a little bit about Montgomery for All, if you're not familiar. We are a grassroots group organized by the Coalition for Smarter Growth. I'm Jane, I'm the Maryland Advocacy Manager. And so I work with CSG and help to organize Montgomery for All. And we first came together around Montgomery County's general plan update to create a platform for that. And to advocate for a general plan that paves the way for a more equitable, prosperous, and sustainable future. So our platform for that plan includes things like more housing options, protecting vulnerable communities, equitable safe access to amenities, a world-class transit network, and a lot more, because there's a lot to do and a lot that our issues relate to, as we will talk about tonight. As you will likely be seeing in your emails sometime soon, we are about to undergo our August-September membership drive. This will be our second time doing that. We now have, after the first membership drive and our first sort of formal year of operations, we now have over 160 members. So that's really incredible. Becoming a member costs $5. And that's just for the whole year, $5 for the whole year. If you want to get a fee waiver, you can totally reach out to me, and that is fine as well. Anyone who lives or works in Montgomery County is welcome to join. The or works because we recognize that a lot of people would like to live here but aren't able to afford it. And that's part of the issues that we advocate around. So we want to make sure that everyone's able to come. So become a member at montgomeryforall.org and learn more about us there. So updates about the things that we have been working on with Thrive 2050, which is the county's general plan update. Additional outreach around that plan is happening, and that is being coordinated by consulting group Inspire Green. So they've been doing basically sort of three things. A community survey, a forum, and focus groups is my understanding at least. And so the survey is still live, and maybe somebody could put a link to that in the chat. The forum happened on Tuesday night. And I believe the focus groups are still ongoing. They have to give all of their report about what they found from this additional outreach, as well as their suggested amendments to the plan and a new chapter on racial equity and social justice in early September. And then the council is expected to begin their work sessions on the plan in mid-September and vote on the plan by the end of October. So we're looking forward to that, looking forward to those work sessions. There's certainly different amendments that we would love to see as an organization added to Thrive 2050. And we've written about those before. You can find some of our suggestions on our website, especially language around affordable housing that we would like to see included. And the last update is that the Montgomery for All Steering Committee and Advocacy Priorities elections will be happening in late September. So become a member and keep your membership updated before then. You get to vote in that election if you are a member of Montgomery for All. Our steering committee is 12 people. Right now we have 9 of those seats filled. So if you are interested in running for steering committee, please be encouraged to do so. I'll also be sending that out pretty soon about to apply for the steering committee. And I'm really excited because last year we had our advocacy priority election, and the idea is that until Thrive is passed, Thrive is our #1 advocacy priority, because then after that we will focus on implementing Thrive. But Thrive, of course, has taken longer than we initially expected it to take. But hopefully this time around, we'll get to really focus on our advocacy priorities more in earnest. We were able to work on other things, such as the Chevy Chase Library, and CSG works on a wider breadth of issues. But excited for Montgomery for All to sort of embark on this new stage after. So let's get into the topic for tonight, how to talk about smart growth. And first, I want to introduce my co-presenter here, Mike English, who is one of our amazing steering committee members. And any other sort of aspects of your many things that you do that I should introduce, Mike?
I mean, that's the main thing. Yeah, Montgomery Pearl steering committee member, live in Silver Spring, as a very subtle art indicates there. And yeah, been in the area since 2012. And yeah, I do clarify. It sometimes comes up. I don't work for CSG or anything like that. My civilian life, I'm a federal auditor in an unrelated field. But yeah, just kind of started off gradual and then not so gradual, getting to advocacy. And like 3 years ago, I would have been someone coming here with no idea how to talk about this stuff, and that's sort of what this is all about. It's not none of us know as much as what we're doing, as you probably think. There's no secret sauce. So yeah.
No, and we're all always learning, for sure. So yeah, thanks to Mike for co-presenting with me. So for our conversation tonight, attendees, I would like to ask you to put in the chat what have been some of the biggest challenges you faced when talking to people about smart growth, and where do you normally have these conversations? Are you having them in person, on the internet, at community block parties, at the library? Where are these things happening? Give a minute for people to type.
Yeah. And Jane, I believe my quick Google in memory, that is the right survey link, but if it's very wrong, please correct it. But that
It looks correct to me.
Yes. There's been a few, but I think that's the latest one.
Yeah. All right, anybody going to be the first? Oh, there we go. Many messages spread on social media, untrue claims, unfounded conclusions. Civic Fed is where somebody has these conversations. People are jaded if this can actually be accomplished, that cities can change. That's definitely, yeah, that might be what I would say is the biggest challenge. During elections, or when there is a proposal and people flood Rockville's community forum in opposition. That comes from somebody who would know, Rockville council member. Neighborhood gatherings and social media. I discussed smart growth with my neighbors, fear surrounding traffic, getting started online. Great. Yeah, we're gonna, I think, hopefully cover a lot of these things today and hopefully address a lot of those challenges. Although this is certainly a sort of introductory, wide-ranging conversation here, and there's certainly a lot more to get into the weeds about, when people bring up specific concerns around traffic, what to say to them and things like that. We'll maybe get into that a little bit later. The format for tonight will essentially be that there are 3 sections about what is smart growth, the language that we use, and how to have the conversation. And after each of those sections, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions, and to also share your own experiences with this, because we all can learn from each other. And then we'll have an opportunity, hopefully at the end, for a sort of more general discussion about this topic. So, and as a overview, these are not hard and fast rules. Everyone is different, including you. And so the way that you approach these conversations, whether you're an extrovert like me or an introvert like Mike, to put Mike on blast,
It's very true. People don't often guess it, but it's I've had more than my share of people thinking I am better talking with strangers than I am. So yeah, you don't need to be a life of the party person to get involved with this.
Exactly. So everyone has a different way. Some people are like, yeah, I can't wait to go knock on my neighbor's doors. And other people are
Whereas
like,
that sounds terrifying to me, frankly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do other things. So yeah.
All right, so let's jump into it. Part 1, what is smart growth? I won't dwell too long on this part because I think a lot of you are pretty familiar, but it's okay if you're not. So smart growth is essentially an idea about where we live and how our communities are built and connected. and how can we grow in a way that is smart. So it encourages a mix of building types and uses, diverse housing and transportation options, and development within existing neighborhoods. So it's all about having more concentrated and compact growth. And a lot of times, smart growth is seen as an opposition to sprawl. This has largely been adopted by a lot of different places, including Montgomery County. So Coalition for Smarter Growth has advocated to the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which is sort of the council of where all the governments of the region, the DC region, come together to sort of talk about overall regional planning issues. And there is a vision for this network of transit-oriented communities. And it looks like my slide got a little cut off here, but these issues are extremely interconnected with economic development, equity, the environment, especially. This picture that I have here is a picture that I actually took myself, being the land use nerd that I am. I always try to sit on the window side when I'm on an airplane, and I was able to snap this photo of looking at Montgomery County versus Loudoun County. And you can really see the difference between Montgomery County's agricultural reserve, where we have about 1/3 of the county is protected in the agricultural reserve and has either no or extremely limited development, versus Loudoun County, which has had a more pro everywhere growth approach, and so has seen a lot of sprawl, and thus a lot of their natural lands sort of developed and built upon, and all the associated sort of traffic and greenhouse gas emissions that come from that. Thank you. Yeah, I was really proud of this photo. This was a great sort of plane takeoff going outside of National.
All right. And yeah, so for this, and again, some of this one in particular, like some of these will be oversimplified ideas for discussion, but what this is sort of getting at is when you separate out your community activities, it means not only driving for every trip, but driving more for every trip. So the neighborhood you're seeing on the left, so some people will be like me, like I haven't owned a car since 12 years ago. My car died right before I moved to New York City, and that became sort of path dependent, not buying a car again. So the neighborhood on the left, you can, walk around more, do other things. But even if you're driving, it's 2 miles versus if you have to get on a, divided highway, separated crossings, all that. It's a much harder, it's not a compact community. We talk, I think Thrive gets into 15-minute communities that can be either walking, driving. There's specifics around it. But the general idea being that even if you don't want to give up your car, even if, it's not necessarily a goal for everyone to sell their car or anything, it can still be a better, more connected life when you don't have to go all the way out of your way, out of a neighborhood into another one to hit every aspect of what you need for your life.
Perfect. And this is something that has been embraced even by an organization like the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. They were actually kind of one of the helped to create the original tenets of smart growth, which I was talking to some of my colleagues before this. They think that maybe some of these are a little bit outdated, but I think, when generally talking about, what are the principles, I think that this is still pretty useful to talk about. So I won't necessarily read all of them here, but you can see mixing land uses, compact design, range of housing opportunities, walkable neighborhoods, distinctive, attractive, preserving open space and farmland, using existing infrastructure, variety of transportation choices, making development decisions predictable, fair, and cost effective, encouraging community and stakeholder collaboration and development decisions. So yeah, I would agree, Mark. I think that these still seem up to date. There's always more to add because smart growth being such a huge bucket for housing, land use, transit, environment, parks, all of the above, gets into a lot of different things, but at its core, this is kind of what it's all about. And if you're interested, the EPA has a lot of reports about smart growth, and some really cool tools around it. So that was actually one of my first internships was at the EPA Smart Growth Program. So I have a soft spot for it in my heart, and I want more people to know that it exists. Great.
Yeah, my first internship was at HHS, but whatever. I got there through other means. That's fine. Smart growth. On top of that, like it's well, solution. I mean, we say it's a solution, right? None of these things are panaceas, and it's no, nothing will do it on its own, smart growth or otherwise. But it can help ease traffic index congestion. It can provide better access to jobs, schools, and services. Some of it not only, but including, there's obviously a history of when you get to redlining and restrictive covenants or things like that. Some of it's explicit, some of it is just economic segregation. When you allow for more options, it helps ameliorate that somewhat. Can help climate, air, and water pollution with your emissions. You got better transportation choices, walk, bike, riding transit, and still driving, even if you have to. It's a little bit easier. The big one, and we'll get into this later and like find your own voice, but you'll find things that you advocate more on, like for various reasons. Like housing is the thing I talk about most. And, I really do think that more housing choices and mixed use, walkable environments close to transit, not only is a nice lifestyle, but it really does. Those tend to be because they're desirable places to be. Where they tend to be more expensive, and the more choices you have, the more affordable the housing can be, given the constraints. And then tied into that, that can lead to inclusive communities and neighborhoods where a variety of housing options are available: ownership, rental, big, small, expensive, low cost. In my case, I moved half a mile down Eastern Avenue from an apartment into a condo, and it's like that same neighborhood. And having that choice allowed me to, transition within the same neighborhood and someone else to move in. So
Whoops. Sorry. Whoops. I didn't mean to click. Oh no.
it's okay. You're getting a sneak preview of all the, yeah.
Great. I think that's the end. Yeah, that's the end of this section. So does anybody have any questions for this part about what is smart growth? Feel free to put in the chat, or I have now given people the ability to unmute themselves if they would like. I'll give it another minute. One of the things you learn when facilitating meetings is to allow uncomfortable silences to give people the time that they need. All right, I don't see anything in the chat and nobody is unmuting. Oh, something's in the chat. Mark is saying that my experience is that people understand smart growth, they may not like it. Interesting. Yeah. I think the one thing that I hear a lot of times as like a misconception, and that's part of the reason why we included like I like this slide a lot. People feel like, you're going to make me sell my car and I'm not going to be able, you don't want people to be able to drive anywhere. You want everybody to ride a bike. Not everybody can walk everywhere, which isn't true. I mean, I would love for as many people to not drive as possible because we do have a climate crisis, but, I still drive places sometimes. It's about making it so that you don't have to drive for every trip. And if you don't want to spend $10,000 a year on a car, you don't have to.
Right. And similarly, like, and there's definitely people who know what it is and don't like it, but a lot of times people will feel that we're trying to impose things on them. And like, if every time somebody calls, zoning reform, one size fits all zoning, a little part of me inside dies, because the status quo of only allowing detached single family homes is the actual one size fits all zoning, right? But it's framing, and a lot of this is unfamiliar, and there's a natural inclination for people to be afraid of change, and that's ultimately what we deal with a lot. And at a base level, some of the concern is understandable, and we want to get past the reactive fear about it.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing I'll say about smart growth is to acknowledge that it hasn't always had a perfect record on racial equity and social justice. And I think even just when I was first starting to learn about smart growth back in like 2016, people did not want to talk about racial equity and social justice. They did not want to talk about gentrification and displacement. That has changed a lot in a really short period of time. And whereas smart growth was like primarily came from the environmental and conservation movement, and was connected with those elements of making society better, there have now been a lot more conversations about how, when we're changing our communities, we need to make sure that people who already live in urban areas are, protected and not displaced as these changes happen. And so, smart growth, not a perfect history, but I think has come a long way in a pretty short period of time, but still, of course, has further to go. So with that, let's go to part 2 and talk about how we talk. So when talking about smart growth, I think it's best to use plain language as much as possible. And I am definitely not perfect on this, especially as somebody who comes from a wonky policy background. But it's really important to try to be as straightforward as possible. Oftentimes, plain language can be more positive language, like such as saying homes rather than housing units. Sounds very technical. And so it's better to avoid that type of technical language, such as zoning. A lot of people don't know what zoning is, or acronyms such as MPDU might be something that, if you're familiar with affordable housing programs in Montgomery County specifically, is something that makes sense to you, it stands for the Moderately Priced Dwelling Unit Program, which is Montgomery County's inclusionary housing program. And both of those terms are incredibly technical. And so we say, try not to use them, especially when communicating to audiences who you wouldn't expect to know that. So some examples here, instead of zoning reform or something like eliminate single family zoning, which sounds really intense, and can make people think that you're like banning single family zoning, which is not what it means to eliminate single family zoning, but I'll put that aside. Saying something instead like make it legal to build duplexes and townhomes. And then in that, you're specifically saying what would be allowed: duplexes and townhomes, not missing middle housing, which nobody knows what that means. So make it legal to build duplexes and townhomes, or more homes of all shapes and sizes. And then another example, instead of affordable housing, which both can have sort of negative connotations for whatever reason, or, what's affordable to me is not necessarily what's affordable to the person next to me on the street. Like, affordable means something different to everybody. And so if you're talking about like mixed income housing, where homes are available at different like income prices. If you're talking about subsidized housing, say that, or homes that are affordable to the middle and working class, you can go ahead and say that. But affordable housing, I think specifically, is one of those terms that can be really useful in certain situations, but oftentimes there's not really a shared understanding of what it means.
Yeah, and I think you hit on the important part there, Jane, where like, there are situations where it is, and like all this is sort of framed as sort of like if you're giving someone a 101 or something like that, or just having a conversation with someone who's not in on this. There will be times to use more technical terms, and I also, even when I should be using less technical terms, I certainly don't pat 1,000 on not doing that. But like, you'll even run into things. I remember one time where somebody was pointing out even subsidized housing can be problematic, because they're like, well, a mortgage where you can write off your taxes is also subsidized. And like, that person is not incorrect, right? It's not the way we normally think of it. So it's just to say that there are exceptions for every rule. And this is sort of, if you're trying to reach someone and trying to get them, not even necessarily on board, just introduce them to the concept. These are sort of guidelines to it, not assume you're in like an affordable housing forum, which you might be at some point in the future. So. All right, and some more examples of as we were preparing for this, I use a lot of the things in the avoid column quite a bit, especially the first one. But so staying away from density, concentration of population, high rise, development. It can be used, but carefully. It has negative perceptions. It also goes into quick aside about developers. Like, I say it because I mean it. I have no particular love lost for developers or single family homeowners, like, or any homeowner. I say that as a condo owner. Like, I think they're both self-interested people that need scrutiny, but there is definitely one that gets more grief than the other. And not to say that there's nothing to that, but you need to be aware of that when you hear the term. FAR, floor area ratio, or square footage, it just gets technical. Housing unit, like Jane said, instead of just a housing unit, apartment, it's still a home. Even if it's not a house, it's a home. Let's call them what they are. So things you can try: compact, walkable, proximate. You could actually probably, that's sort of in between, I'd say, but connected, diverse, opportunities, options. We don't have to go through all of them, but more of a framing of this thing that's in the more technical void column. What is the actual effect that it's giving us that we're looking for, is sort of what most of these are.
Yeah, and everybody has different like associations with certain words. Like you might be somebody that hates the word yeah, like proximate or something like that. Like maybe that really rubs you the wrong way, or like access really rubs you the wrong way. So this is obviously not, you know, a
Right.
universal thing.
And when we're talking, in this note we have in the bottom left is key. Like none of this is to deceive or hide what we're saying. It's like we're trying to paint a more positive picture and getting away from the negative connotations people have coming in. None of this is to obfuscate what we're trying to, you know, advocate, because we're very open about that. But
Exactly. And so when sort of, you know, stringing these words into sentences and trying to, you know, tell a story, a lot of times when you're trying to, especially like convince somebody of something, like, you know, I have definitely sat there and like linked people article and study after article and study trying to convince them of certain things, but that oftentimes doesn't work. And you know, just because you say compact instead of density doesn't mean somebody will be like, oh well, now it's okay. Like that alone does not convince people. It's sort of like a foot in the door to have a conversation. You need to frame a story is what is usually works the best. So people hear a message in terms of what they already know and believe to be true, especially with their like their lived experience of, you know, how they have experienced, such as like the housing market and their neighborhood and getting around to different places. So we want to have frame stories that people can see themselves in. And a lot of times we sort of naturally start out by talking about the issue by saying like, we haven't built enough housing, we need to build more housing, or like we haven't invested enough in affordable housing, or buses need to run more frequently. These sort of like very specific issues that we are advocating on, which makes sense because that's, you know, that's why you're here. You're somebody who cares about those things. But when talking to other people, that might turn them off. That's not the issue that sort of gets them fired up. So it's best to start out by evoking values, such as in this example, like choice, and like people should have choices about where to live. People should have the opportunity to live where they want to live, and especially to live close to where they work and where their kids go to school. And then the context, the housing market. So the housing market is messed up. The housing market makes it hard for people to have those choices and opportunities. And then you can sort of get into the issue of that's because we haven't built enough housing to keep up with demand, especially in highly desirable places that were often developed in exclusionary ways. There aren't enough different housing types because we haven't allowed for them. And of course, this is just an example of one issue within the realm of smart growth. This could, you know, we could make this about transportation or about anything else, but the overall principle here is that you start out by evoking those values and then eventually get into the issue, and tell that story. And we'll get into this a little bit about helping, you know, learning people's story first, that you can help figure out, you know, how does this fit into what this person cares about.
And Mark in the chat sort of gone to a little bit where, like, you know, will your children be able to live here? Will civil service workers be able to live here? Like generally here, the answer is no. And that's like a big part of the problem. And you can also talk about it more personal terms in your own way. Like, I mean, I've talked about like, I have a relatively privileged bubble and I still have friends that are getting priced out. And that makes me think about what's happening to people who are less fortunate if it's that hard for people I know. Or I've had people say that, you know, I must be rich to live in a luxury condo in downtown Silver Spring when I won't get my condo cost under $300,000. No house here comes anywhere close to that, right? But people have these preconceived notions, and when you tell your story, it can sometimes help. But as Jane said, you kind of need to learn their story in order to make that connection. So
yeah, we'll get into that in the next section.
right, and so this is advice from the Siteland Institute focus groups, which Jane can talk more about that. But it's a, I don't know, seminal is probably stronger, but it's a widely accepted, like, you know, framing that is helpful.
Yeah, you don't have to read, we don't have to read through
Yeah.
all of this. This is obviously a wall of text, which I usually
Right.
try not to do in presentations, but
Right.
yes, Siteland Institute is a primarily focused on housing in the Cascadia region. And so this was what they learned from doing many focus groups, especially about housing. So Mike, if you want to kind of go through it, you don't have to read it word for
Yeah.
word, but this is
So
what they
again, you're
learned.
not like, look, there's time and like I do it quite a little bit talking about housing crisis, right? But if you're connecting on a personal level, you want to talk more about like your vision for the community, your commitment to, racial and income diversity, like, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, but most there's exceptions to every rule, but like most people are coming at this from an earnest place, and maybe they're telling them what they want to hear all this, but there's very few people in this that are motivated by active malice or anything like that. Like there are often a lot of people who, I think they're doing harm by their advocacy. They probably think the same of me. But if you can explain to them why it can be helpful for this, you can, and I have in some cases reached people that way. Similarly with the anxiety of experiences, displacement, with, use empathy, use proactive solutions, branching off on that a little bit, like just, I think a lot of times people assume that advocates of, smart growth and zoning reform and all this, like love change and aren't bothered by it. I actually, I hate change. Like it freaks me out. But that doesn't mean that we can use that to just be okay with the status quo all the time. Again, we get into avoiding technical supply and demand language and opt for, talk about the housing shortage, talk about like there's more people that need homes than there are homes. And the last one I'll get into, because I want to distinguish what we are and are not saying, so you're elevating diverse messages and perspectives, including in particular the voices of renters, people of color, and low-wage workers. And we want to make sure, like, what we're not talking about here is like, do engage in tokenism and highlight the voice you have. What we're saying is, like, most of you have probably run into this. When you go into community forums, when you go into hearings in the middle of the day before the planning board, like, the people who can go to those tend to look like me and be older and even richer, right? And like, that's a problem. And we really want to have, you want to get people who do not have those advantages to have a voice. And that's what a lot of this is about.
Awesome. So that is the end of part 3 about language and the language that we use. The next part will be about actually having that conversation. So any questions or discussion around language? Any reactions to some of the options that we shared there? I'll even go back to the slide.
Yeah, in the chat, we have 40% of Arlington teachers live in Prince William County, according to official that Aisha spoke to. And yeah, that I believe that. I mean, I would assume Montgomery County has some similar percentage with outlying counties. Well, yes, Mark, you can type again. You were never banned. You did fine.
Please continue to type.
Getting feedback that it's helpful framing, so glad to hear that.
What language have you found to best resonate with people whose voices you're trying to engage? Mike, do you want to take that at all?
Yeah, I mean, assuming, and Rita, correct me wrong, assuming you're talking about like traditionally underrepresented groups is how I'm going to go with this. That's not what you mean. But, and like, look, I mean, I think the first thing, honestly, is to have some humility about it. Like, look, I'm a relatively privileged white guy. There's things that I don't know, and I need to know that I don't know them, and you need to like talk with people in groups that do know that. But I mean, there are but I mean, there are things like some of them is common sense. Some of it's common sense. Like you have. That like when you show up to a hearing and it's all like retired people, like that's not who lives in the county all the time. When something is and I will, one thing I'll do, and I'm not sure it's sort of what you're getting at, I will point out I've been in hearings saying like this is all well and good, but like this is not representative of the community. Do not take this public input to be representative of the public will, and just pointing that out. And to get a little bit more technical, like I personally would like to see, and this is me, not Montgomery for All speaking, although Jane, feel free to jump in, like more outreach, that like more quicker and like better targeted outreach. So like less community forums and more like do canvassing that gets out to people in neighborhoods and things like that. I think could go a long way, but there's no one tool there.
Yeah, I think what I've found, included when I have been out canvassing and talked to folks like who are renters in downtown Silver Spring, about this issue. A lot of people like do intuitively understand it. Like the couple that I talked to, they rent in Summit Hills, and they would love to buy a, like, you know, small condo somewhere in the surrounding neighborhoods of downtown Silver Spring. And, you know, once they hear that the people who currently live there don't want that, you know, they understand the dynamic that, you know, that it's you know, difficult for especially younger people and people who come from like traditionally disadvantaged backgrounds to sort of get the foot in the door into some of these neighborhoods, and that people who have that are in those neighborhoods and have successfully gotten it, you know, kind of want to not open that door to any sort of change that would let in people like them. And people understand that. So I think it's just sort of like having that conversation, and that framing does seem to resonate with a lot of groups that I have talked to
Yeah,
about sort
and
of that difference.
to jump on that real quick, so that reminded me of a piece. So Jerusalem Demzos, who is A, from Montgomery County, and B, awesome. I think she writes for the Atlantic now. She sort of made her name with Fox, but I can try to find after. I believe the name of the article is like "Community Input is Bad." Actually, like if you type that in, you'll find it. But basically, it's an oversimplification. There's, you know, there's some mirth there. But what she's getting at is that, and I bring this up in my advocacy too, is it can make sense on a base level to say that you know, the neighborhood that is being affected by change should have the biggest say in there. But what I point out is when we know that there's been historical barriers there, to insist that the community essentially get veto power over that when it's made up of people that, you know, got through an unfair system, that's going to perpetuate exclusion, and that's not helpful. Yeah, and there's also a few things in the Mark citing a few good things in the chat. School overcrowding comes up a lot. The planning department actually had a good study that showed that a lot of that came from turnover of single family homes, not development, but it absolutely comes up a lot. And yeah, a lot of people are moving up to Frederick because we're not making the room, and that's where you get pressure for highway expansion because people move further out and then feel like they want another lane. So
Mark, do you feel like that framing of like, because we're not making room for our children or grandchildren is something that you found to be very successful? Feel free to unmute or just put in the chat.
Yeah, sorry for dominating the chat to some extent, but I don't have a good way of framing the issue. I've tried over 4 or 5 elections. It's incredibly difficult in Rockville and in Montgomery County in general. So what I am going to try more, if I run again, is you know, what is the future? What is the future of your children? How are they going to be impacted? When, you know, if you have a 5th grader, that child is only 8 years away from looking for a job and a home. And if you have a 9th grader, that child's, you know, so you get the idea that, you know, a lot of people don't care about diversity and equity. A lot of people want to protect their homes and their neighborhoods. And so you got to get personal.
Yeah.
And that, and, you know, quite frankly, I don't avoid density because we need density. But I try to explain that. And we don't have a lot of room in Montgomery County for new development. We can't tear up agricultural land anymore, as you well pointed out. So what do we have? We have infill, we have old decaying shopping centers that most of the time happen to be near transit. So that's perfect place to have mixed use housing, community housing, that kind of stuff. But it's a really tough fight. And so my thing is, you gotta make it personal. Where's your child gonna live? Where is your child gonna get a job? What can they afford? Council of Governments came to Mayor and Council in Rockville a few meetings ago and really adequately, overwhelmingly documented the housing shortage.
Mm.
And maybe I can find that slideshow and send it, but there's no doubt we're thousands of units behind. And so I don't shy away from talking about supply and demand because it's really at the heart of the issue. So anyway,
Yeah.
I stopped talking then.
No, thank you, Mark, for sharing that experience. And yeah, if you could send those slides, that would be great. The last thing I'll say here, and then we can move on to the next section, is I found that sometimes the thinking about your kids argument doesn't work super well, because people are like, well, I can't wait for my kid to get out of the house. But what does work really well is grandkids. People really want to be close by to their grandkids. This is how I'm going to potentially get my mom to not move to, like, Vermont or something. It's just like, wouldn't it be nice if you were not super far away? Anyway, so I found that is slightly more successful for people than kids, although of course it depends on who you're talking to, if there's somebody that even has kids or grandkids, but just a side note there. Alrighty, let's move on to part 3, having the conversation. So these conversations can happen anywhere, as we sort of talked about at the beginning. People put in the chat a lot of different places. There's social media, there's Nextdoor and community listservs, which I know can oftentimes be kind of toxic places, and we'll get into that a little bit. There's neighborhood events, there's your place of worship, there's dinners that you have with friends or family. Really, anywhere that you're talking to people is a place that this conversation can come up. I was just walking in the Silver Spring Town Square listening to some music the other weekend, or the other night, for their like Thursday night concert series. And this guy just strikes up a conversation with me and is talking about how much he loves living in Silver Spring because he can't drive. He's an older man that has a walker, but he loves living in Silver Spring because he can walk everywhere. He doesn't have to have a car, great events, things like that. And so I was like, all right, I didn't even bring it up, but this guy's talking about it. So we can really talk about these things anywhere because they touch every part of our lives.
Yeah, and we've hit on this a little before, but knowing your audience, and again, and marketing this a little bit, like there are times you use of technical terms and all that, and this kind of gets into it somewhat, but it's always important to approach conversations with empathy and prioritize listening and asking questions so you can understand where the person you're talking to is coming from. Because like, even if somebody's new at it, like you need to hear the story to know how, what will convince them. But also, like, a big goal of mine is like, whether it's on this or anything else, the bucket of things I don't know is bigger than the bucket of things I do know. And like, you learn as part of this process, and there's perspectives you don't have, and you're not going to be convinced or agree with anything, but with everything, but it is about their perspective. And then there's a lot of benefits, and the conversation ideally will unfold organically over whether to talk about, climate change being important to them, or equity, or having an easier commute, the kids or grandkids, a more walkable lifestyle. Like, it's just, good to kind of go where the conversation goes, as you don't want to have a thing that you are determined to talk about and force that square peg through that round hole. That's generally not helpful.
Yeah, exactly. In community organizing, this is called learning somebody's self-interest about like what brings them to that table to have that conversation with you. And you share your story, you ask for that person's story, and you sort of get to know each other on a more personal level before diving into those issues. So this sort of gets into that. Share your own story and why you care. Make it personal, and you'll probably get better at telling your story over time, about why do you care about smart growth. For me, I talk a lot about how I grew up in Calvert County in Southern Maryland, which is a very ex-urban place. And one time my mom and I, for fun, decided that we should walk to the closest grocery store, which took about an hour and a half on rural roads with no shoulders, and was really dangerous. And then once we got there to the little community grocery store with the cow statue on top, we got ice cream, and then we called my dad to pick us up. And that was like the only place to like conceivably walk to. So I dreamed about living in a place where I could walk and bike. And once I got to college and I went to University of Maryland and had that metro access, I was in DC all the time, and biked everywhere on campus. And so having that life experience at the same time that in my classes, I was learning about how sustainable cities were connected with climate change and with racial equity and social justice and all these other things that I cared about. That's really what solidified for me that this is the thing that I wanted to do professionally. And when you're doing this, speak in your authentic voice. You don't need to put on a show. You just need to be who you are.
Yeah, and that last one, like, definitely agree with it. And that doesn't mean have no filter and don't like. There's things I don't say in testimonies. There's tweets I don't send. Like, believe me. But like, it does mean that, like, you have your manner of speaking. You have the stories like to tell. I use hand gestures that I'm half aware of, right? Like, you don't try to completely sanitize things. You want to, the things that are important to you will give you energy to talk about this. The way that you speak, you want to be authentic, A, because you're not a machine and this takes energy, and B, you'll connect better when you're actually talking about something that matters to you. And just speak like you do, maybe, filter it 10%. I don't know. Be have decency, right? Like, be a creature in society that understands you need politeness, but speak with your authentic voice.
Yes, we'll get to that later, Stuart. That'll be our last slide there. So this kind of goes off of what Mike was saying. I've kind of lost track about whether this should be your slide or my slide.
I think it's I don't know. Well, you go for it as well.
But yeah, like Mike was saying, I mean, we're here to be kind. It's really unfortunate that, you can call them smart growthers, urbanists, YIMBYs, whatever. YIMBYs especially have gotten this like reputation for like getting into Twitter arguments and for being mean. Which I think a lot of times is unfounded, but other times there are certainly people who maybe I agree with them on the issues, but I don't like how they're approaching it, and I think that they should be nicer. But I mean, as always, as being a person, be kind, assume the best of people, even if other people are not assuming the best of you. That has been one of the really big things that I have had to learn in this job, is that people do not always assume the best of me. And in fact, they often assume the worst. And that's really hard and doesn't feel great. But you don't have to do that to other people. So those conversations where you're actually talking to people are an opportunity to sort of, set the record straight. And you probably have preconceived notions about the person you're talking to as well. And speaking to them and asking questions is a way to, understand who they really are and why they really believe the things they believe. And it's also important to be kind to people because smart growth is not necessarily intuitive. It includes a lot of unlearning preconceived notions, which can be uncomfortable. People don't like to feel like what they've always known is wrong about, electric cars are the solution, or, change is bad. Seeing a new apartment building is a bad thing to have in your neighborhood. And sort of smart growth kind of challenges a lot of those preconceived assumptions about community development and about how, the options of how people live their lives, about like, hey, maybe having a single family detached home with a white picket fence like is one version of the American dream, but there are a lot of other versions as well. And then another thing that's also kind of a hard lesson to learn is to know when to stop. Like, not everybody is going to be convinced, and maybe you'll agree on some things, but not on other things. And then sometimes maybe at some point people would be convinced, but you're not the right messenger for it. They need to hear it from somebody else who can maybe connect with their life experiences on a different level, somebody who will frame things in a different way. There's so many ways to go about this stuff, and it's okay if you're not the right messenger.
Yeah, second all that. And another thing I'd add to that is, like, you're gonna mess up. Like, there are people who delight in pointing out when I have some self-compassion there when it happens, but you still want to assume the best. And like, and it depends. Like, I will also say this sort of aside, but like, take breaks, listen to your bandwidth. Like, there are times, like in the last 3 weeks, I was, there's some forums and stuff I didn't go to because like I just didn't have it in me and needed to recharge. And like, you're not doing anyone any favors if you're grinding yourself down to the bone. But you also want to, you will sometimes get some grief, like and my experience not being everyone's, but like, in the same conversation, I was called by someone both a hardcore communist and a developer sellout, which is an interesting combination. But like, and I've been called the developer shill enough that like, if that was true, I'd actually make money doing this. But like, you're not gonna. It's not that I never clap back, but you're not going to convince that person, and we'll kind of get to it there. But always remember that there's an audience, and oftentimes you're speaking to them, not to the person you're speaking with. I don't want to get to it.
I think you're getting to some of the things that are on this next slide here.
But it's like, you want to be decent, A, because it's good, and B, because you're not doing the argument any favors if you're just getting into a big back and forth.
So yeah, if you want to jump into this next slide as well.
Oh,
Mike.
yeah. So, yeah, okay, the internet. Yeah, right. Yeah, little too much on there myself. So, yeah, it's often the most contentious conversations happen, whether it's Twitter, especially like Nextdoor does tend to skew more towards their demographic that is not particularly hospitable to smart growth. There tends to be a larger audience, for better or worse. And this is a big one. Everything's a bubble. This call is a bubble. Housing Twitter is a bubble. Nextdoor is a bubble. Your neighborhood lifter is a bubble. They're not all equal. Some are more insular than others, but everything has a bias. And the experience you have there, just because you see people agreeing with you here, doesn't mean that you're right and there's no argument against it. And it doesn't mean you're wrong around that. Don't overvalue online discussions. If you're willing, offer to take the conversation offline. That's a big if. I will do that sometimes. Back to the introvert thing, I say no more often than I say yes, but I do say yes sometimes, and I try to be honest with myself when that is a yes. And like I will say, like, amount of time I spend advocating, yeah, most of it's online, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's not necessarily where the most value is happening all the time. And a final one, and I have gotten better at this, still work to do, is you don't have to reply. There are, and there's in between. Sometimes it's
Usually
helpful.
I'm the person telling Mike that he doesn't
Yes,
have to
usually
reply.
Jane is very diplomatically, saying things we have discussed before. But and sometimes there's a happy medium where when you're not going to convince someone. If there's a troll, you don't need a big back and forth. Maybe you want to do a one-off reply and kind of knock it down to the level, but often you don't. A, you'll drive yourself nuts, and B, like it's not helpful.
We had a really good question in the chat from Rita about, would you suggest staying away from the terms like NIMBY and YIMBY, which stand for not in my backyard and yes in my backyard. I would suggest staying away from those terms because people don't like, being painted on like one side or another. Often people have, beliefs or positions that might be like often categorized as like both. That doesn't mean, I put this in the chat as well, but I'm saying it out loud for posterity's sake, but that doesn't mean that I don't ever use those terms, especially in like casual conversation with people. But especially for somebody who's like new to these issues, I've talked to folks who are like, I heard people talking about YIMBYs and NIMBYs, and I don't even know what even all of that means. And they don't want to be involved with it because it sounds like a war that they, don't need to take the time and hardship to get involved with. So I would recommend staying away from that.
Yeah, I would, and again, with the caveat of everything, speak your authentic voice. Like, well, listen to your gut there. But yeah, I would generally agree, especially early on. And they're loaded terms for better and for worse. So like, YIMBY, even within the YIMBY movement, it means different things to different people. And it's just usually the person hearing it will have some assumptions about it, and at the very least, keep that in mind when you use it. That is what I would say about it.
And yeah, Mike said this already, but we all make mistakes, and that's okay. You won't always be ready to engage or have conversations with people, and it's okay to step away, especially if you find yourself in a conversation that is becoming very combative. So be forgiving to yourself. We're all learning. I count myself in that. I know Mike does as well. It's a continual process, even after many years.
Tough, as my lapsed Catholic guilt definitely still kicks in sometimes, but like it's a thing to work on. Like no one's perfect, and it's going to happen. So
is there oh, that's just like a really loud siren. Sorry if you can hear that. I was like, is that my building's fire alarm? Okay. Last slide.
Well, it's from the
here.
garage. You'll hear it on my speaker in like 3 minutes, but yeah, we'll see.
I think this is our last slide. But this gets at what Stuart was putting in the chat earlier. When you're having this conversation with people, sometimes there are conversations where you're just sort of like introducing the issue, but especially if you're like grabbing coffee with somebody to talk about this stuff, you want to provide them with an actionable next step of where do we go from here. So maybe it's like, oh, hey, follow these people on Twitter so you know what's going on, or whatever social media they use. Sign up for an email list, specifically the CSG Montgomery for All email list. Come to the next Montgomery for All meeting that's happening. We have monthly meetings, virtual and in-person options for whatever you prefer. And then really important step is to follow up after that conversation to check in, say like, oh, here's an article that relates back to something that you brought up. I thought you might find this interesting. Oh, here's the registration link to go to this meeting. And then, see if they have more questions, ask them more questions. And especially for like, if people do have questions that you don't know the answer to, that's totally fine. Feel free to reach out to Montgomery for All to ask for, hey, where's a really good article about like uh, bus rapid transit or something like that, so that people can learn more. We can point you in the right direction of resources. And then also, send people our way to continue that conversation. If they want to continue or like get more involved and actually like take the step into advocacy.
Yeah, and the follow is big. This is not an act. I'm actually realizing like there's someone I said I would follow up with like 2 days ago that I haven't. So right, we could do that. But yeah, that is a big thing. And I will say as I sort of volunteer myself and Jane for things that I think should be, but like, definitely follow up there. There are often times where I have said like, listen, here's what I know, but like if they have an organizational, like I'm an amateur at this, also I'm like, listen, I'm happy to answer this, but if you really want more info, talk with Jane, talk with, this person. You can, if you have a contact that you think is trusted on these, you can refer to someone else that you think will be helpful. Or if you think going back to you may not always be the right messenger, if you have someone you think is and you think will be willing to be that. And yeah, before we get in, because Mark, I saw in the chat you had something about many of people who oppose development live in a development. They don't like I will do that a lot. And my framing on that often depends on how spicy I feel like being at the moment. But like, yeah, like a lot of times people will deride something as, developer greed or what have you. And to be frank, there's nothing to, they are profit motivated, all that. But also like, most houses were not manifested out of goodwill, right? They were typically built by a profit seeking entity. And a lot of times people, it's not that they are hypocrites, it's that you think of your home differently than you think of a building. And it's an emotional disconnect that can sometimes be helpful to point out.
Yeah, I like reading Suburb by Royce Hansen, which I highly recommend for anyone who's super nerdy about Montgomery County land use politics. It's essentially the history of Montgomery County's development and talks about a lot of key areas. So it talks about specifically my building in downtown Silver Spring and how a lot of people did not want it to be built. But, I love living here. I'm glad it's here. I think the other, hundreds of people who live here would agree. So yeah. That's it for our presentation. Now, oh yes, I will put that in the chat. And so now, yeah, questions, discussion, we, typically go till 8:15. So until then, we can sort of talk about whatever you all want to talk about. I will recognize that for this, we didn't necessarily go into like how to, combat specific, like, often points that people make about like, well, if there's new development around a metro station, that means more traffic in my neighborhood. We haven't necessarily gotten into things like that. I hope to create more resources for the Montgomery for All website that sort of have like go-to articles and things to read about that sort of stuff. But I recognize that that's kind of an element of this that we didn't get into in the presentation. Yeah, so any questions, feel free to also take yourself off mute and have a conversation.
Yeah, and I'll say like, yeah, common conversation. It doesn't have to be a question, just anything you
Or
want to raise.
Experiences that
Yes.
you have had talking to people. Mark.
Hello.
Oh, I saw Mark's hand, and then we can go to you, Mike Larkin.
I can go second.
Okay. Mike L.
Sure. I have a specific question. Just maybe I'm not the only one who faces this. And I think Jane had mentioned this, but I'll ask it in the forum for everyone here. I guess the big thing that I get thrown at me a lot, and especially when I was canvassing, if you talk about building more housing and speaking to renters, well, what's that going to do for my rent now? Essentially. So I could talk about, more compact development, more housing types. But if you're someone who's cash constrained, you don't have any liquidity at all, I don't know what to say, which is kind of ridiculous when I think about it, because, I can't necessarily go out and rent a $2,100 apartment myself right now. So, or whatever the price is, I just threw that out there. So that's a very specific question, but I do get it a lot, because people don't necessarily associate the whole supply and demand argument, and myself too, until fairly recently. So
Yeah, no, I think and that is I think a fair critique of a lot of sort of focusing on land use issues because in supply issues is that that's very much sort of a long-term fix, although oftentimes not as long as one might think. And we're not necessarily like CSG and Montgomery for All are not necessarily the organizations doing like tenant organizing. And although we often support and sign on to pushes for rent stabilization or rental assistance, eviction prevention, all of those sorts of programs, like that's sort of the part that you have to do while you're doing the community change, is those policies that both protect vulnerable communities, invest in affordable housing, and preserve existing affordable housing. And so, your smart growth is not going to be very smart if it's not being equitable. So I think that those policies can sometimes, last thing I'll say, like sometimes there are disagreement about those policies within the world of people who would label themselves as YIMBY, urbanist, or smart growth. But I think for the most part, generally, smart growth as a movement is supportive of those policies.
Yeah, I think Jane, you hit on the biggest part where like it's never, the number of people think this is true is not zero, but it's the minority of the movement. Like these are not panaceas, and I don't think it's helpful to present them as that. I do think, and I think the research shows that supply helps bring prices down otherwise to what they would otherwise be, and by all means talk about that. But as Jane said, like I think it needs to be done a certain way, but I support rent stabilization. I support, right of return on developments. I think that the land use decision for Langley Park is different than the land use decision for Chevy Chase and near Silver Spring. Like you don't, we are not saying that this cures it all. And I think that skepticism is healthy, and that if people understand that you're not just trying to say like, do this one quick trick and you'll have an equitable society, I think that goes a long way. When you show that you understand the limitations of what you're arguing for, I think it comes off as authentic. And then I think Mark, was it Mark next? And then we'll go to Joe, Jane? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found it very interesting that the 2050 plan was put off until October, which just happens to be between the primary and a general election. And there are going to be term limited council members who are going to vote on it. And I'm not sure how that issue would have played in the primaries, but since Montgomery County typically elects all Democrats in the general election, that it politically just might be the right time to do it and be done with it. Any comments on that? I mean, I gotta say elections matter a lot in this stuff.
Yeah, no comment other than yes, I agree. And I hope that that now is the time and Thrive will be passed, and then we can start the next 3 decades that it will take to implement it, if not longer.
Yeah, seconded on everything Jane said.
Joe?
Yeah, first of all, a great presentation. I had a question when it came to, it sounds like most of the topics we're talking about are more formal or more serious conversations. But the situation that comes up to me most often is when you hear someone say, some casual mention that touches on these subjects, about how bad it is to buy a house right now, or something like that. And I guess, do you guys have any suggestions in terms of shorter term conversations on different topics and how to engage people in those kind of formats. Things like coworkers, neighbors, things like that.
Yeah, I'll take the first stab. I mean, like, and again, it depends on the exact conversation, but generally, like, I'll just talk about like my personal story or experience. At this point, I've like gotten deep enough into advocacy that I'll, sometimes stories will be from that sphere. But I mean, just where the conversation is, like, what, I'll have people, they'll talk about like, they'll think where I live is more expensive than it is, or they'll say like, how do you get around without a car? And I just talk about what it is, and like it's about being reactive. I know that's sort of broad and unhelpful, but I mean, it's just gotta kind of go where it is, and like know that there'll be like there'll be times where just like engaging in depth and trying to push is gonna be helpful. Like I was at, of all things, the allergist 2 weeks ago, and they mentioned like how they were upset that there was all this development in Wheaton that was gentrifying the area, and I'm just like, there's nothing I'm gonna say in the next 10 minutes that's going to convince this person. I said something about like, well, single family homes are expensive too, and they kind of nodded, and then we talked about like, the Orioles or something. Like I don't know, but like there's just times where sometimes it can do more harm. Like it doesn't always need to be, yes, sometimes just pay for your groceries and leave, right? You don't need to do it every time.
Yeah, of course.
But
yeah, sometimes it's enough to just like when somebody talks about like how expensive rents are, to be like, yeah, that's crazy. and then maybe if you know them well enough, be like, later follow up with them, be like, oh, here's an article or something like that to kind of like continue the conversation. But yeah, like
I mean, sometimes I'll drop in, oh, I wish they would let more duplexes in this neighborhood, in this area.
Right.
There you go. Yeah.
Surgical strike, right? Yeah, no, that's good.
a well placed singular comment.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I feel like honestly, a lot of times I'm not the best person to answer that, and honestly, neither is Mike, because both of us are such nerds that will just be like, well, zoning.
Oh yeah, no, like it's a running joke. My family once commented that I'm like the bad guy from every Hallmark Christmas movie because like I want to tear down the shop for like, yeah. So I can't speak to this super well. I will always want to talk about this, but yeah.
And that's part of being #authentic, Mike. So that's fine. That's your truth.
Yes, it is.
Any other sort of, I haven't been looking at the chat.
Yeah, I'm looking. I don't think there's anything we didn't. There's some comments that I think are helpful about like, yeah, realizing that someone who's usually skeptical but realizing there were common goals. Like there's some helpful comments there. I don't think, if we did miss your question, please speak up, but I don't think we have.
Question for people: what other sort of resources after that would you find it helpful for when you have these conversations with people? Like, what can we do to help support you in this endeavor? Thanks, Joe. Maybe that's a question to think on, because we definitely, Montgomery for All and CSG, want to provide you with the support that you need to sort of like go out there and get more people involved in this, because at the end of the day, we are a grassroots organization, and 160 members is great, but we want to hopefully reach as many people as possible. And not every person's going to become a member, of course, but hopefully we want to create a movement here in Montgomery County that is supportive of smart growth and will help to push things in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to grow the movement, and something we hit on before is we want to, there are perspectives out there that we want to hear and learn from and incorporate, and a big part of that is expanding our base as well. So it helps from that aspect too.
Yeah. Cool. Well, if nothing else, we can call the meeting there. I'm glad that people are putting in the chat that this was good and helpful. Yes. This is recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel, as all of our virtual meetings are. Keep an eye out for our September meeting, which will likely be September 22nd, and will be a in-person meeting, some sort of walking tour, happy hour combination for our Smart Growth Social Goes Local fall CSG event. And also keep an eye out for the Montgomery for All steering committee and advocacy priority elections.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.